For 8 years, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez treated Ben Shapiro's debate challenge like an indecent interruption, branding it catcalling, because that label let her avoid the substance while pretending the refusal itself was a feminist stand. The move was politically convenient and designed for the media ecosystem that made AOC famous, where a sharp phrase could erase the original question before anyone noticed that the question had never been answered. But once she finally sat across from Shapiro, there was no committee gavel to hide behind, no sympathetic moderator to redirect the exchange, and no edited Instagram clip capable of converting an evasion into a victory. Within the opening minutes, the reason for 8 years of avoidance became obvious. Shapiro's format demanded precision. While AOC's political brand had been built on expansive moral language, theatrical certainty, and answers long enough to bury the point. Yes or no was dangerous territory for her, because either answer created a path to the next fact, while the speeches she preferred were designed to make the audience forget where the path had started. The event was sold as a conversation about progressive politics, wording chosen to make AOC's appearance look voluntary, elevated, and policy-driven rather than what it really was. The delayed acceptance of a challenge she had spent nearly a decade insulting instead of confronting. Her team had reportedly prepared for Shapiro's rapid-fire style by studying his binary questions, his refusal to surrender the frame, and his habit of tightening the sequence until every escape route disappeared. Their solution was obvious. Never answer in one word. Reject the premise. Expand every response. Control the clock. And transform cross-examination into a campaign speech. AOC opened exactly that way, talking about inequality, housing, working families, and the failures of government with the polished cadence of someone who had mastered the art of sounding urgent without becoming specific. She directed her energy toward the camera because the camera had always rewarded emotion more generously than evidence, and because a television audience can admire conviction even when conviction is doing all the work that facts were supposed to do. Then, she returned to the 2018 invitation and defended the cat-calling comparison, arguing that a man who demands a woman's time and acts entitled to an answer deserves the label, a line guaranteed to produce applause because it had already been tested on her supporters. Shapiro did not waste time defending his personality, arguing over manners, or begging the room to believe he had good intentions, because that would have allowed AOC to replace accountability with grievance before the debate had even started. He simply agreed that he was not entitled to her personal time, then pointed out that roughly 720,000 constituents funding her congressional salary were entitled to answers from the person claiming to represent them. That distinction cut through the performance immediately. This was not a private demand for attention. It was a public challenge to a public official whose policies, fundraising appeals, and national influence were built on claims she expected millions of people to accept. And before AOC could stretch that point into another speech about power, gender, or intimidation, Shapiro moved to the first question that her team knew was coming and still could not make disappear. The Green New Deal had been introduced in 2019 as a transformational national framework, promoted with apocalyptic urgency, moral certainty, and the kind of political branding that turns a resolution into a fundraising engine before anyone has explained how the machinery would work. Shapiro asked the most elementary question attached to any major proposal: how much would it cost? And AOC responded by describing it as an investment framework rather than a conventional budget item, which was a polished way of saying she would not provide a number. He asked again, cited the American Action Forum estimate of $93 trillion over 10 years, and emphasized that the resolution contained no formal cost estimate, no defined funding mechanism, and no clear implementation timeline. That was the first crack in the performance, because AOC had spent years presenting herself as the intellectual and moral authority behind the Green New Deal. Yet the basic fiscal question produced a lecture about framing instead of a figure, a range, or a plan. But the cost question was only the surface wound, because the next sequence would drag her from missing numbers into a more dangerous contradiction involving climate panic, campaign messaging, and a deadline she later tried to dismiss as mere rhetoric. Shapiro moved directly to AOC's 2019 warning that the world would end in 12 years unless climate change was addressed, a line she had repeated across interviews, speeches, social media posts, and fundraising appeals. Because fear is politically useful when the deadline is close enough to panic donors, but distant enough to avoid immediate accountability. 7 years had passed, so he asked whether America was now only 5 years away from the end of the world. And suddenly, the certainty that had powered years of activism became a rhetorical device. That answer was not a clarification. It was an admission that the dramatic deadline had never been intended to survive contact with a calendar, even though it had been presented to supporters as a literal reason for immediate political and financial action. Shapiro tightened the contradiction by arguing that when a campaign uses a claim to generate urgency, attract supporters, and raise money, then later dismisses that same claim as rhetoric, the issue is no longer merely exaggerated language, but whether donors were moved by a statement the speaker herself no longer defended as factual. AOC had expected another ideological fight about climate science, but Shapiro was forcing her to explain the difference between what she said to mobilize people and what she was willing to defend once the emotional effect of the statement had already been harvested. He then turned to the legislative record, where AOC's reputation as a relentless fighter collided with the only measurement that matters after speeches, hashtags, committee clips, and fundraising emails have all faded. Whether the bills actually became law. Shapiro asked how many of the 42 bills she had introduced during 7 years in Congress had crossed that line, and the answer was 0, a number so small that no rhetorical expansion could make it look like achievement. During that period, AOC earned roughly $1.2 million in congressional salary, built one of the largest personal political platforms in the country, and repeatedly presented legislative proposals as evidence that she was transforming Washington from the inside. Yet 42 introductions had produced 42 political products and 0 enacted laws, leaving Shapiro to ask whether donors were funding legislative success or merely the permanent appearance of resistance. The question mocked the heart of the AOC brand without requiring a personal insult, because it separated motion from progress, visibility from results, and the performance of fighting from the measurable outcome that elected officials are paid to deliver. The next collision involved capitalism, a system AOC had publicly described as irredeemable while using its platforms, incentives, merchandise markets, and payment networks to build one of the most lucrative political operations in modern progressive politics. Shapiro asked whether she still believed capitalism was beyond redemption, and when she tried to soften the statement by criticizing only the system in its current form, he returned to the yes or no format that stripped away the protective fog of qualification. A yes would mean she truly condemned the ordinary economic arrangements used every day by mechanics, shop owners, restaurant workers, contractors, and the small businesses she claimed to defend. While a no would expose the original declaration as language chosen because outrage sells. She searched for a third answer, but there was none, and the refusal itself exposed how carefully her politics depended on saying something radical enough to excite supporters, while remaining vague enough to escape the practical consequences. Shapiro then pointed to the capitalist machinery powering her own campaign, including more than $15 million raised through Act Blue and 58 tax-the-rich sweatshirts sold through commercial transactions that looked remarkably redeemable when the proceeds flowed toward AOC. That contradiction became harder to excuse when he moved from the slogan to the spending records, because donors were not merely buying merchandise or supporting a message. They were financing an operation whose lifestyle appeared far more comfortable than the working-class image used to solicit their money. The source record described hundreds of thousands of dollars connected to private flights and tens of thousands spent on luxury hotels, expenditures that might be legally explainable but were politically poisonous beside years of sermons about privilege, excess, and the moral corruption of elites. AOC had told small donors that $10 and $25 contributions were helping wage war against a rigged economic order. Yet the campaign reports suggested an organization enjoying the flexibility, convenience, and expensive comforts normally associated with the class she condemned. The hypocrisy required no complicated economic theory, because the fundraising appeal said revolution, while the expense report appeared to say private travel, premium lodging, and a political machine operating with the very indulgence it attacked in others. Shapiro did not need to shout the accusation, because once the anti-capitalist message and the campaign spending were placed side by side, the numbers mocked AOC more effectively than any insult could. Then he introduced Danny Molina, a 28-year-old auto repair shop owner from East Elmhurst, Queens, inside AOC's own congressional district. And the contrast was devastating, because Danny represented the ordinary capitalism she discussed as though it were a moral disease. He earned roughly $47,000 a year, repaired cars, charged customers for labor, paid rent and expenses, and used what remained to support his family, which made him a capitalist by the plainest definition, rather than by some abstract ideological category. Danny knew the cost of every repair, the price of supplies, the amount entering his business, and the amount leaving it, because one unexplained discrepancy could trigger penalties, scrutiny, or the collapse of a shop operating on narrow margins. AOC controlled a congressional office, a national platform, and a campaign operation worth millions, yet repeatedly treated basic questions about costs, outcomes, and expenditures as hostile traps invented by political enemies. But the next line of questioning would move beyond hypocrisy and failed legislation into something much darker, because Shapiro was about to compare AOC's public safety rhetoric with the crime conditions unfolding inside the very district she claimed to understand better than anyone else. Shapiro returned to June 2020 and asked whether AOC had publicly supported the movement to defund the police, a question that should have required nothing more complicated than confirming the language she had placed under her own name. Instead, she immediately tried to replace the word defund with a broader explanation about community investment, social services, prevention, and reimagining public safety, as though changing the definition after the political moment had passed could erase what the slogan originally meant to the people who heard it. Shapiro refused to accept the substitution because the post existed, the wording was unmistakable, and the issue was not whether AOC could now produce a softer explanation, but whether she still stood behind the position that had helped elevate her national profile during the most emotionally volatile months of 2020. AOC rose from her chair and turned the answer into a performance directed toward the room, using volume, moral urgency, and movement language to create the impression that the question itself was an attack on community safety rather than a demand for accountability. The maneuver was familiar, but this time the speech did not dissolve the record, because Shapiro had already fixed the audience's attention on the original statement and the consequences that followed inside her own district. He then asked whether she knew that crime in her district had increased by 70% since 2019, and the hesitation revealed something more damaging than ideological disagreement. She did not appear to know the figure. A member of Congress who had helped popularize a national movement aimed at reducing police funding could not immediately address the crime trend affecting the people who lived beneath the practical consequences of that movement. Shapiro cited FBI uniform crime data and placed it beside a February 2025 constituent newsletter in which AOC's office claimed that the community was safer because of investments she had championed. Her newsletter said safer, while the figure presented during the debate showed a 70% increase, and no amount of emotional reframing could make those two descriptions fit inside the same factual reality. The contradiction mocked the entire performance because it did not depend on Shapiro's politics, his personality, or his interpretation. It depended on AOC's own communication colliding with a federal statistic she seemed unprepared to discuss. Shapiro argued that the discrepancy mattered beyond ordinary political exaggeration, because the newsletter was written for constituents and supporters who could reasonably believe that her policies had already produced measurable improvement. If a donor-facing communication claimed the district had become safer, while the available federal data suggested the opposite, then the problem was not merely optimism, messaging, or a disagreement over tone. It raised the question of whether supporters had been given a factual claim that protected AOC's political brand, while concealing conditions that were far less flattering. Once again, she responded by shifting from the record to moral scale, citing health insurance, homelessness, poverty, and the suffering of millions of Americans, then demanding to know what legislation Shapiro had written or what doors he had knocked on. The tactic attempted to place the interrogator on trial, but it also advertised the weakness of her position because none of those larger national problems answered the crime figure, the newsletter language, or the question of whether her office knew the difference. AOC reminded the audience that Shapiro was a podcaster, not a judge, not an elected official, and not someone who had served in Congress, hoping his lack of institutional authority would make the evidence appear less legitimate. Shapiro calmly accepted the description and then pointed out that the podcaster had just informed the Congresswoman of the crime rate in her own district because the Congresswoman did not know it. He also reminded viewers that while he had never written legislation, AOC had introduced 42 bills and passed none of them into law, turning her attack on his resume into another indictment of her own performance. The humiliation came from the simplicity of the comparison. The elected official had the salary, staff, title, access, and institutional resources, yet the unelected commentator appeared more prepared to discuss her district, her record, and the claims published by her own office. Her supporters applauded the passion, but the applause increasingly looked like protection from scrutiny rather than proof that any of the disputed facts had been answered. Shapiro returned to Danny Molina because the small business owner represented a standard AOC's defenders could not dismiss as partisan hostility, ideological warfare, or media manipulation. Danny knew what entered his repair shop, what left it, what every part cost, how much each employee earned, and what would happen if his records failed to match his claims. While AOC controlled a campaign fund exceeding $15 million and still treated elementary numerical questions as unreasonable demands. The double standard was impossible to miss. Danny could face penalties for a small discrepancy, but AOC could contradict crime data, evade cost estimates, defend zero legislative outcomes, and still receive a standing ovation for speaking with enough intensity. Shapiro had now linked the Green New Deal, the 12-year climate deadline, the legislative record, the anti-capitalist fundraising machine, campaign spending, public safety rhetoric, and the newsletter claim into one growing pattern of language, repeatedly separating from measurable reality. But the most dangerous phase had not yet begun, because once those contradictions left the studio and entered campaign filings, watchdog complaints, and formal referrals, AOC would no longer be facing only a hostile interviewer with a microphone. The debate did not end when the cameras cut, because the clips immediately escaped the studio and entered political, legal, and compliance networks that AOC's team could not control with a closing speech, a standing ovation, or another carefully edited video designed to restore the emotional frame. The first viral segment showed her refusing to provide a cost for the Green New Deal, while Shapiro introduced the $93 trillion estimate, and it spread because anyone who had ever managed a budget, approved a contract, or asked what a major project would cost, understood the failure without needing an economics degree. The second clip carried greater institutional danger by placing her February 2025 newsletter beside the federal crime figure cited during the debate, exposing the gap between the claim that the community was safer and the data showing a 70% increase since 2019. One clip damaged competence, the other threatened credibility, and together they turned a televised embarrassment into a documentary trail that could be reviewed long after the applause. Emotional speeches, partisan defenses, and studio lighting had vanished. AOC could dismiss Shapiro as a podcaster, attack his motives, or accuse him of reducing public service to yes or no questions. But she could not dismiss her own words, her own campaign communications, or the records that now appeared to contradict the image her political operation had sold to small donors as authentic, disciplined, transparent, and morally superior to the establishment she condemned. Within the first week, the National Legal and Policy Center filed a supplemental complaint with the Federal Election Commission, adding the debate contradictions to an existing matter involving $18,725 in payments described as leadership training, and using the newly recorded exchanges to frame a broader pattern of questionable descriptions. The filing emphasized specific conflicts rather than broad partisan accusations, including the public image of commercial travel beside reported private flight spending, the Safer Community newsletter beside the crime data, and the anti-capitalist fundraising message beside the campaign's own spending patterns. That structure was dangerous because it relied less on Shapiro's interpretation than on AOC's statements and identifiable records that could be compared line by line, turning what defenders called a hostile interview into a usable evidentiary sequence built from her own language. The Federal Election Commission also received approximately 2,300 individual complaints during the same week, many likely repetitive, politically motivated, procedurally weak, or based only on viral clips, but volume still created administrative pressure because thousands of submissions cannot be erased by a social media rebuttal or a speech about persecution. By the second week, the House Office of Congressional Conduct received a referral requesting a preliminary examination of AOC's communications with constituents and donors, not declaring guilt or pretending that misconduct had already been proven, but asking whether the documented discrepancies deserved formal verification under congressional standards and whether the language used to raise support matched the records available to reviewers. The political damage became more serious inside AOC's district when Danny Molina appeared on local television from his repair shop and asked how someone could promote a massive national proposal without knowing what it cost, while ordinary owners were expected to know the price of every part, every hour, every invoice, and every tax obligation. Danny did not speak like a partisan operative, legal activist, campaign consultant, or conservative celebrity, and that was precisely why his criticism landed harder than another Republican attack. Because he sounded like a working constituent who knew that numbers determine whether an ordinary business survives. He said he had voted for AOC in 2020, but no longer believed he would support her again, and that admission mattered, because campaigns fear movement among former supporters far more than predictable hostility from permanent opponents who were never available to persuade. A coalition of 47 New York small business owners then signed a letter demanding a public accounting of AOC's campaign expenditures, arguing that they were required to track every dollar, explain every discrepancy, and accept penalties when their records failed to match their claims, while a multi-million-dollar political operation appeared to receive applause for evasions. By the end, Shapiro had connected the Green New Deal cost, the 12-year climate deadline, 42 failed bills, anti-capitalist rhetoric, campaign spending, private travel, public safety claims, crime data, and donor communications into one pattern. AOC could still command a room, trigger applause, and deliver a polished speech, but she could not make the record change its numbers or turn another emotional performance into measurable legislative or financial accountability for constituents.